Very sweet Passover from Sarah and Frank. So let me invite my panelists back because I would like to now have a discussion on the concept of slavery. You know, Moses, the story of Moses, as we all know, is that he, of course, then represented the Jewish people. He grew up in the Pharaoh's home, and then he saw the injustice. He realized who he was. He went and argued with Pharaoh, the 10 plagues, the story of reaching the Red Sea, splitting the Red Sea, wandering for 40 years, arriving in Mount Sinai, etc., which is a magnificent story. Slavery, as it relates not only to Passover historically, and freedom, of course, which we'll get to later, but I'd love to hear, I look at the world today. We're living in the 21st century. And you'd think that we would have learned after 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years and not have it be a part of our lives today. So who wants to, tackle this first? Anybody want to, touch this horrible third rail?
Well, I am happy to chime in and, let's look right here in our own backyard and look how, slavery is manifesting itself right in our own communities, where, we see a lot of undocumented, individuals who are being taken advantage of and being paid, way below minimum wage. That's a form of slavery, and being expected to work very long hours, that's a form of slavery. When we look at, the mass incarceration, in our country, the United States has more incarcerated people than any nation on the earth. And when we look at the demographics of those who are incarcerated, it's Black and brown communities, such as, slavery. You mentioned, sex workers and what they're going through. And we shouldn't forget also the enslavement of people based on their socioeconomic standing, and how people who are, below the poverty line are enslaved, even though that they're American citizens and what have you, and could be, white families in middle America who are barely making, ends meet and are being, put in these kinds of situations. So I think it's critical. And, of course, then, when we look at, the international landscape and looking at the different countries where this is happening, whether it's in countries in the Middle East, whether it's in Africa, in Asia, we see this happening through the caste system and in a variety of other ways. So
I think this idea that the Yazidi Christians and the Uyghurs and it's all, in North Korea there are slave labor camps. In Syria, there are camps of people enslaved. And it's all over the world. I don't want to just single out those because in Africa and in Asia and in South America and in Central America, slavery is rampant. And yet somehow, as always, the world kind of stands by and says, oh, that's terrible. How terrible. And yet it goes on.
Well, I'm going to approach it from a slightly metaphoric, paradigmatic perspective. These stories are so profound and meaningful to us, and they capture our imagination and speak deeply to the heart because we all have been, we've all experienced this. And in terms of slavery, that there's no question we are all at different ways and times and places enslaved through different mechanisms. And we could, the list is just obviously too long to get into, but we really, when we think about it, this paradigm speaks and gets right to the heart of the matter of who we are as, our, humanity that is in need of redemption and is in need of freedom and in need of restoration. So I think the story of the Israelites being set free, however we understand that literally or metaphorically, it becomes a very powerful paradigm for us to realize our own need for being liberated from enslavement. In my own tradition, we speak an awful lot about the S word, right, which isn't always real popular, but those things that have resulted in a brokenness within us. That's the way I like to talk about sin. The broken spirit and the broken parts of our humanity and what we're capable and what we're meant to be has gotten all mucked up. And this is a story of how God's redemption is stronger than all that. And it's a word of hope. And it certainly gives us the ability to kind of follow suit and say, yeah, we all need to be redeemed. We all need to be freed from this slavery.
Ted, do you have a thought on this?
Sure. It's always hard to speak last in a sense when you have such able people having articulated so well both the metaphorical and the physical on the ground forms of slavery that exist today. So maybe I can just speak briefly about another kind of slavery, psychological one, that has to do with limitations that we impose on ourselves. And maybe in certain ways we enslave ourselves by limiting our potential, limiting our capacity for self-actualization. Quoting from the Baha'i writings, there's a phrase in the hidden words of Baha'u'llah that says, "Free thyself from the fetters of this world, loose thy soul from the prison of self." So what is the prison of self? Well, sometimes our own fears limit us from going and trying something new or expanding our boundaries. Sometimes our fear of other people, what somebody will think, what a spouse or a friend or the larger community will think, might also kind of push us into a smaller box than we need to be in, and not to allow ourselves to give free expression to our creativity and whatever internal capacities we have. And I like a Kabbalistic approach to, you can compare the Sephirot to gates that are blocks on the ascendancy from the ego realm of Malkut to the self-actualized Keter, the crown. And each of these Sephirot are gates or capacities that can both be liberating and enslaving, and can hold us back. Being too loose, too chesed, too loving, and not having boundaries can be a problem. Being too rigid and too having too much gevura can also be a problem, so and so forth and so on. So the whole concept that is introduced and add to this conversation is how we enslave and limit ourselves and not allow ourselves to grow spiritually and be self-actualizing.
Yeah.
And I think just to take that, to the next level, the idea, I always grew up believing or wanting to believe that in many ways we create our own realities. We can indeed take steps to create what we want to create. And yet you're right. Very often we find ourselves enslaving ourselves, not getting into relationships or not getting out of relationships. We're not pursuing that business that I always wanted to do, but I'm really afraid. So slavery really takes on many forms, internal, spiritual, and external. I'd like to talk to the concept of freedom. We discussed slavery, which is where Passover kind of starts. The Jews were slaves in Egypt. But then Moses came and freed us. I'd love to hear your perspectives on the concept of freedom. And again, I want us to talk about it from not only a historic perspective, but also from a contemporary perspective. What is freedom today? How do we even, define it anymore? And so I'd love to hear your perspectives. Why don't we start with Ted?
Well, thank you. I remember as a teenager sitting in on a class that was discussing different definitions of law. And one of the definitions that stuck with me 50 years later was a definition that was suggested that laws are the just restraints that set us free. And we reflect on that, in Jewish tradition, the commandments, the law, the Torah is so essential. And in any kind of ethical monotheism or any kind of ethical system whatsoever, we all recognize the need for restraints on our behavior that allow room and place for other people to stand. You know, if we're the bull in the china shop that takes over the whole place and there's no place for someone else to have a word or a feeling or, you know, any ownership of what's going on in that space, then, you know, we've crowded them out. And so that without restraint, then there can be, you know, no freedom. And so you can reflect on that in very simple ways. If I have the freedom to kill whoever I want to, that imposes on somebody else's right. So I'm willing to give away my right to be violent in my reaction to my frustrations or whatever else in order that our collective freedom can be maximized. And so there's that sense of restraint. And I'd just like to reflect on one very current incident that shows maybe how in this country somewhat we're out of whack with our sense of freedom. This whole debate about whether people should be obligated to wear masks. And I need a drink too to clear my throat. So this young woman was hardly old enough to remember anything about World War II, had a mask with a swastika on it.
Oh,
She says, "We fought a war, so we didn't have to wear masks. We fought a war against fascism." You know, and so her view of freedom was not having to comply with anybody else's desire. And those who lived through, or our parents lived through World War II, know the restraints that were put on people in order to be able to fight World War II. There was rationing of gas and food and all kinds of other limitations. Here, there were blackouts because there was shipping. German U-boats were torpedoing ships up and down the coast of Florida. There were blackouts up and down the coast. You couldn't turn the lights on in your house. So to imagine in your head that there were no restraints on people in order to fight the Nazis is totally not a historical fact. You know, we needed this collective restraint in order to, you know, mount the war against fascism. And so then we need to think about freedom in the context of appropriate restraints and limitations to that maximizes our collective freedom.
right.
I would say that for me, you know, thank you, Ted, for sharing that story. It's awful. You know, for me, as I think about freedom, what resonates for me when it comes to the word freedom is, you know, being able to freely worship, right? To freely assemble, to freely say what is on your mind, you know, without, you know, censorship. The freedom to choose where you want to live, the freedom to be able to occupy, you know, a space because it's your God-given right as a human being. God put us on this earth and we should be able to live where we want to, you know, live versus feeling that, you know, there has to be, you know, the borders that actually divide us, right? And that actually uproot people. I think, you know, those are the things that, you know, when I hear the word freedom, it resonates with human rights and the things that we fight for every day.
So I've always straddled the two worlds or multicultural worlds of different languages, different cultures, and different religions. And it was always a very difficult kind of pathway for me to walk because I never felt completely at home in any particular one of them, even though I was born in Japan. Do I look Japanese? According to the stereotype, no. And most people wouldn't accept me as Japanese, but I identified myself as one. And it was my home. It was my birthplace. I went to Japanese schools. I still dream and think in Japanese. It's my identity, which is why I do really mean that my soul is definitely Asian. But it was not accepted by that culture. And when I was, in a sense, kind of enslaved by that concept of not belonging, though wanting to, and then being kind of outcast and sent away from Japan and trying to find a home in this United States as a 18-year-old when I came to college for the first time. And supposedly being a U.S. citizen, that my parents had applied for citizenship on my behalf, being a very kind of someone who was really unaware of American culture and unaware of the American way of life, or the different kind of values and pop culture and all, the whole list, made it feel very much like a difficult kind of pathway to try to traverse, until I realized that all of this was bound in our egos, which feared the other rather than embraced each other. And for me, the real pathway to freedom and what binds, keeps us enslaved, is the inability for us to come outside of ourselves and see each other as the essential, humanity that we are.
חג שמח.